The Magician's Nephew, Book 1, The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 10, The First Joke and Others Matters. It was of course the lion's voice. The children long felt sure that he would speak, yet it was a lovely and terrible shock when he did. Out of the trees wild people stepped forth, gods and goddesses of the wood. With them came fauns and satyrs and dwarfs. Out of the river rose the river god with his naiad daughters. And all of these and all the beasts and birds in their different voices, low or high, or thick or clear, replied, "Hail, Aslan, we hear and obey. We are awake, we love, we think, we speak, we know." "But please, we don't know very much yet," said the noisy and snorty kind of voice. And that really did make the children jump, for it was the cab horse who had spoken. "Good old Strawberry," said Polly. "I am glad he was one of the ones picked out to be a talking beast." And the cabby, who was now standing beside the children, said, "Strike me pink. I always did say that old ad a lot of sense, though." "Creatures, I give you yourselves," said the strong, happy voice of Aslan. "I give to you forever this land of Narnia. I give you the woods, the fruits, and the rivers. I give you the stars, and I give you myself. The dumb beasts who I have not chosen are yours also. Treat them gently and cherish them, but do not go back to their ways, lest you cease to be talking beasts. For out of them you were taken, and into them you can return. So do not so." "No, Aslan, we won't," said everyone. But one perky jackdaw added in a loud voice, "No fear," and everyone else had finished just before he said it, so that his words came out quite clear in a dead silence. And perhaps you have found out how awful that can be, say, at a party. The jackdaw became so embarrassed that it hid its head under its wing as if it was going to sleep. And all the other animals began making various queer noises, which were their ways of laughing, and which, of course, no one has ever heard in our world. They tried at first to repress it, but Aslan said, "Laugh, and fear not, creatures, now that you are no longer dumb and witless. You need not always be grave, for jokes as well as justice come in with speech." So they all let themselves go, and there was such merriment that the jackdaw himself plucked up courage again and perched on the cab horse's head, between its ears, clapping its wings, and said, "Aslan, Aslan, have I made the first joke? Will everybody always be told how I made the first joke?" "No, little friend," said the lion, "you have not made the first joke. You have only been the first joke." Then everyone laughed more than ever, but the jackdaw didn't mind and laughed just as loud till the horse shook its head, and the jackdaw lost his balance and fell off, but remembered its wings. They were still new to it, before it reached the ground. "And now," said Aslan, "Narnia is established. We must take thought for keeping it safe. I will call some of you to my council. Come hither to me, you, the chief dwarf, and you, the river god, and you, the oak, and the he-owl, and both the ravens, and the bull-elephant. We must talk together, for though the world is not 5 hours old, an evil has already entered into it." The creatures he had named came forward, and he turned away eastward with them. The others all began talking, saying things like, "What did he say had entered the world? A Nevil? What's a Nevil? No, he didn't say a Nevil, he said a weevil. Well, what's that?" "Look here," said Diggory to Polly, "I've got to go after him. Aslan, I mean, the lion. I must speak to him." "Do you think we can?" said Polly. "I wouldn't dare." "I've got to," said Diggory. "It's about Mother. If anyone could give me something that would do her good, it would be him." "I'll come along with you," said the cabby. "I like the looks of him, and I don't reckon the other beasts will go for us. And I want a word with old Strawberry." So all three of them stepped out boldly, or as boldly as they could, towards the assembly of animals. The creatures were so busy talking to one another and making friends that they didn't notice the three humans until they were very close. Nor did they hear Uncle Andrew, who was standing trembling in his buttoned boots a good way off, shouting, but by no means at the top of his voice, "Diggory, come back! Come back at once when you're told. I forbid you to go a step further." When at last they were right in among the animals, all the animals stopped talking and stared at them. "Well," said the he-beaver at last, "what in the name of Aslan are these?" "Please," began Diggory in rather a breathless voice, when a rabbit said, "They're a kind of large lettuce, that's my belief." "No, we're not. Honestly, we're not," said Polly hastily. "We're not at all nice to eat." "There," said the mole, "they can talk. Who ever heard of talking lettuce?" "Perhaps they're the second joke," suggested the jackdaw. A panther, which had been washing his face, stopped for a moment to say, "Well, if they are, they're nothing like so good as the first one. At least I don't see anything very funny about them." It yawned and went on with its wash. "Oh, please," said Diggory, "I'm such a hurry. I want to see the lion." All this time the cabby had been trying to catch Strawberry's eye. Now he did. "Now, Strawberry, old boy," he said, "you know me. You ain't going to stand there and say as you don't know me." "What's the thing talking about, horse?" said several voices. "Well," said Strawberry very slowly, "I don't exactly know. I think most of us don't know much about anything yet. But I've a sort of idea. I've seen a thing like this before. I've a feeling I lived somewhere else, or was something else. Before Aslan all woke us up a few minutes ago. It's all very muddled, like a dream, but there were things like these in the dream." "What?" said the cabby. "Not know me? Me, what used to bring you hot mash of an evening when you were out of sorts? Me, what rubbed you down proper? Me, what never forgot to put your cloth on you if you were standing in the cold? I wouldn't have thought of it of you, Strawberry." "It does begin to come back," said the horse thoughtfully. "Yes, let me think now. Let me think. Yes, you used to tie a horrid black thing behind me and then hit me to make me run, and however far I ran, this black thing would always be coming rattle, rattle behind me." "We had our living to earn, see," said the cabby. "Yours the same as mine. And if there hadn't been no work and no whip, there'd have been no table and no hay and no mash and no oats. For you did get a taste of oats when I could afford them, which no one can deny." "Oats," said the horse, pricking up his ears. "Yes, I remember something about that. Yes, I remember more and more. You were always sitting up somewhere behind, and I was always running in front, pulling you and the black thing. I know I did all the work." "Summer, I grant you," said the cabby, "or work for you and a cool seat for me. But what about winter, old boy, when you were keeping yourself warm and I was sitting up there with my feet ice cold and my nose fair pinched off me in the wind and my ends and that numb and couldn't hardly hold the reins?" "It was a hard, cruel country," said Strawberry. "There was no grass, all hard stones." "True, true, mate, true, so true," said the cabby. "Hard world it was. I always did say those paving stones weren't fair on any oss. That's Lennon, that is. I didn't like it no more than what you did. You were a country oss, and I was a country man. Used to sing in the choir, I did, down at home, but there wasn't a living for me there." "Oh, please, please," said Diggory, "could we get on? The lion's getting further and further away, and I do want to speak to him so dreadfully bad." "Look here, Strawberry," said the cabby. "This young gentleman has something on his mind that he wants to talk to the lion about. 'Im and you called Aslan. Suppose you was to let him ride on your back, which you'd take it very kindly, and trot him over to where the lion is, and let me and the little girl will follow along." "Ride?" said Strawberry. "Oh, I remember now. That means sitting on my back. I remember there used to be a little one of you two-leggers who used to do that long ago. He used to have a little hard, square lumps of some white stuff that he gave me, that tasted, oh, wonderfully sweet, sweeter than grass." "Add be sugar," said the cabby. "Please, Strawberry," begged Diggory, do let me get up and take me to Aslan." "Well, I don't mind," said the horse, "not for once in a way. Up you get." "Good old Strawberry," said the cabby. Young un, I'll give you a lift." Diggory was soon on Strawberry's back and quite comfortable, for he had ridden bareback before on his own pony. "Now do get up and see, Strawberry," he said. "You don't happen to have a bit of that White stuff about you, I suppose, said the horse. No, I'm afraid I haven't, said Diggory. Well, it can't be helped, said Strawberry, and off they went. At that moment, a large bulldog, who had been sniffing and staring very hard, said, Look, there's another one of those queer creatures over there beside the river under the trees. Then all the animals looked out and saw Uncle Andrew standing very still among the rhododendrons and hoping he wouldn't be noticed. Come on, said several voices. Let's go and find out. So, while Strawberry was briskly trotting away with Diggory in one direction, and Polly and the cabby were following on foot, most of the creatures rushed towards Uncle Andrew with roars and barks and grunts and various noises of cheerful interest. We must now go back a bit and explain that whole scene had looked like from Uncle Andrew's point of view. It had not been made at all the same impression on him as was on the cabby and the children. For what you see and what hear depends a good deal on where you are standing. It also depends on what sort of person you are. Ever since the animals had first appeared, Uncle Andrew had been shrinking further and further back into the thicket. He watched them very hard, of course, but he wasn't really interested in seeing what they were doing, only in seeing whether they were going to make a rush at him. Like the witch, he was dreadfully practical. He simply didn't notice that Aslan was choosing one pair out of every kind of beast. All he saw, or thought he saw, was a lot of dangerous wild animals walking vaguely about, and he kept on wondering why the other animals didn't run away from the big lion. When the great moment came and the beast spoke, he missed the whole point, for a rather interesting reason. When the lion had first begun singing, long ago when it was still quite dark, he had realized that the noise was a song, and he had disliked the song very much. It made him think and feel things he did not want to think and feel. Then, when the sun rose and he saw that singer was the lion, only a lion, as he said to himself, he tried his hardest to make believe that it wasn't singing and never had been singing, only roaring as any lion might in a zoo in our world. Of course it hadn't really been singing, he thought. I must have imagined it. I've been letting my nerves get out of order. Who ever heard of a lion singing? And the longer and more beautiful the lion sang, the harder Uncle Andrew tried to make himself believe that he could hear nothing but roaring. Now, the trouble about trying to make yourself stupider than you really are is what you very often succeed. Uncle Andrew did. He soon did hear nothing but roaring in Aslan's song. Soon he couldn't have heard anything else, even if he wanted to. And when at last the lion spoke and said, Narnia, awake, he didn't hear any words, he only heard a snarl. And when the beast spoke in answer, he only heard barkings and growlings and bayings and howlings. And then they laughed. Oh, well, you can imagine. That was worse for Uncle Andrew than anything that had ever happened. Such a horrid, bloodthirsty din of hungry and angry brutes he had never heard in his life. Then, to his utter rage and horror, he saw the other 3 humans actually walking out into the open to meet the animals. The fools, he said to himself. Now those brutes will eat the rings along with the children, and I'll never be able to get home again. What a selfish little boy that Diggory is. And the others are just as bad. If they want to throw away their own lives, that's their business. But what about me? They don't seem to think of that. No one thinks of me. Finally, when a whole crowd of animals came rushing towards him, he turned and ran for his life. And now anyone could see that the air of the young world was really doing the old gentleman good. In London he had been far too old to run. Now he ran at a speed which would have made him certain to win the 100-yard race at any prep school in England. His coat-tails flying out behind him were a fine sight, but of course it was no use. Many of the animals behind him were swift ones. It was the first run they had ever taken in their lives, and they were longing to use their new muscles. After him, they shouted. Perhaps he's the Neville. Tally-ho, Timbity, cut him off, round him up, keep it up, hurrah! In a few minutes some of them got ahead of him. They lined in a row and barred his way. Others hemmed him in from behind. Wherever he looked he saw terrors. Antlers of great elks and the huge face of an elephant towered over him. Heavy, serious-minded bears and boars grunted behind him. Cool-looking leopards and panthers with sarcastic faces, as he thought, stared at him and waved their tails. What struck him most of all was the number of open mouths. The animals had really opened their mouths to pant. He thought they had opened their mouths to eat him. Uncle Andrew stood trembling and swaying this way and that. He had never liked animals at the best of times, being usually rather afraid of them. And of course years of doing cruel experiments on animals had made him hate and fear them even more. "Now, sir," said the bulldog in his business-like way, "are you animal, vegetable, or mineral?" That's what it really said, but all Uncle Andrew heard was "Grah." Chapter 11. Diggory and his uncle are both in trouble. You may think the animals were very stupid, not to see at once Uncle Andrew was the same kind of creature as the two children in the cabby, but you must remember that the animals knew nothing about clothes. They thought that Polly's frock and Diggory's Norfolk suit and the cabby's boiler hat were as much parts of them as their own fur and feathers. They wouldn't have known, even though those three were all of the same kind, if they hadn't spoken to them, and if Strawberry had not seemed to think so. And Uncle Andrew was a great deal taller than the children and a good deal thinner than the cabby. He was all in black except for his white waistcoat, which was not very white by now. And the great gray mop of his hair, now very wild indeed, didn't look to them anything like they had seen in the other three humans. So it was only natural that they should be puzzled. Worst of all, he didn't seem to be able to talk. He had tried to. When the bulldog spoke to him, or he thought first snarled and then growled at him, he held out his shaky hand and gasped, "Good doggy, then, poor old fellow." But the beasts could not understand him any more than he could understand them. They didn't hear any words, only a vague sizzling noise. Perhaps it's just as well they didn't, for no dog that I ever knew, at least of all a talking dog of Narnia, likes to be called a good doggy, then, any more than you would like to be called my little man. Then Uncle Andrew dropped down in a dead faint. "There," said the warthog, "it's only a tree. I always thought so." Remember, they never had yet seen a faint or even a fall. The bulldog, who had been sniffing Uncle Andrew all over, raised its head and said, "It's an animal, certainly an animal, and probably the same kind as those other ones." "I don't see that," said one of the bears. "An animal wouldn't just roll over like that. We're animals, and we don't roll over. We stand up, like this." He rose to his hind legs and took a step backwards, tripped over a low branch, and fell flat on his back. "The third joke, the third joke, the third joke," said the jackdaw in great excitement. "I still think it's sort of a tree," said the warthog. "If it's a tree," said the other bear, "there might be bees' nest in it." "I'm sure it's not a tree," said the badger. "I had a sort of idea it was trying to speak before it toppled over." "That was only the wind in its branches," said the warthog. "You surely don't mean," said the jackdaw to the badger, "that you think it's a talking animal? It didn't say any words." "And yet, you know," said the elephant, the she-elephant, of course. Her husband, as you remember, had been called away by Aslan. "And yet, you know, it might be an animal of some kind. Mightn't be the whitish lump at this end be a sort of face? And couldn't those holes be eyes and a mouth? No nose, of course, but then, one mustn't be narrow-minded. Very few of us have what you would exactly be called a nose." She squinted down the length of her own trunk with pardonable pride. "I object to that remark very strongly," said the bulldog. "The elephant is quite right," said the tapper. "I'll tell you what," said the donkey brightly, "perhaps it's an animal that can't talk but thinks it can." "Can it be made to stand up?" said the elephant thoughtfully. She took the limp form of Uncle Andrew gently in her trunk and set him up on end, upside down unfortunately, so that 2 half-sovereigns, 3 half-crowns, and a sixpence fell out of his pocket. But it was no use. Uncle Andrew merely collapsed again. "There," said several voices, "it isn't an animal at all. It's not alive." "I tell you it is an animal," said the bulldog. "Smell it for yourself." "Smelling isn't everything," said the elephant. "Why?" said the bulldog. "If a fellow can't trust his nose, what can he trust?" "Well, his brains, perhaps," she replied mildly. "I object to that remark very strongly," said the bulldog. Well, we must do something about it, said the elephant, because it may be the Neville, and it might just be shown to Aslan. What do most of us think? Is it an animal or something of the tree kind? Tree, tree, said a dozen voices. Very well, said the elephant. Then if it's a tree and wants to be planted, we must dig a hole. The two moles settled that part of the business pretty quickly. There was some dispute as to which way up Uncle Andrew ought to be put into the hole, and he had a very narrow escape from being put head foremost. Several animals said his legs must be his branches, and therefore the gray fluffy thing they meant his head must be his root. But then others said that the forked end of him was the middle, muddier, and that it spread out more, as roots ought to do. So finally he was planted the right way up. When they had patted down the earth, it came up above his knees. It looks dreadfully withered, said the donkey. Of course, it wants some watering, said the elephant. I think I might say, meaning no offense to anyone present, that perhaps for that sort of thing my kind of nose. I object to that remark very strongly, said the bulldog, but the elephant walked quietly to the river and filled up her trunk with water and came back to attend to Uncle Andrew. The cetaceous animal went along doing this till gallons of water had been squirted over him, and the water was running out of the skirts of his frock as if he had been in a bath with all his clothes on. In the end it revived him. He awoke from his faint. What awakening it was! But we must leave him to think over this wicked deed, if he was likely to do anything so sensible, and turn to more important things. Strawberry trotted on with Diggory on his back till the noise of the other animals died away, and now the little group of Aslan and his chosen counselors was quite close. Diggory knew that he couldn't possibly break in on a so solemn meeting, but there was no need to do so. As word from Aslan, the he-elephant, the ravens, and all the rest of them drew aside. Diggory slipped off the horse and found himself face to face with Aslan. And Aslan was bigger and more beautiful and more brightly golden and more terrible than he had thought. He dared not look into the great eyes. Please, Mr. Lion, Aslan, sir, said Diggory, may I, please, will you give me some magic fruit of this country to make mother well? He had been desperately hoping that the lion would say yes. He had been horribly afraid it might say no, but he was taken aback when it did neither. This is the boy, said Aslan, looking not at Diggory but at his counselors. This is the boy who did it. Oh dear, thought Diggory, what have I done now? Son of Adam, said the lion, there is an evil witch abroad in my new land of Narnia. Tell these good beasts how she came here. A dozen different things that he might say flashed through Diggory's mind, but he had the sense to say nothing except the exact truth. I brought her, Aslan, he answered in a low voice. For what purpose? I wanted to get her out of my own world back into her own. I thought I was taking her back to her own place. How came she to be in your world, son of Adam? By magic. The lion said nothing, and Diggory knew that he had not told enough. It was my uncle, Aslan, he said. He sent us out of the world by magic rings. At least I had to go, because he sent Polly first. And then we met the witch in a place called Charn, and she just held on to us when— You met the witch, said Aslan in a low voice, which had the threat of a growl in it. She woke up, said Diggory wretchedly, and then turning very white. I woke her, because I wanted to know what would happen if I struck the bell. Polly didn't want it. I wasn't her fault. I fought her. I know I shouldn't have. I think I was a bit enchanted by the writing under the bell. Do you? Said Aslan, still speaking very low and deep. No, said Diggory. I see now I wasn't. I was only pretending. There was a long pause, and Diggory was thinking all the time, I've spoiled everything. There's no chance of getting anything for mother now. When the lion spoke again, it was not to Diggory. You see, friends, he said, that before the new clean world I gave you is 7 hours old, a force of evil has already entered it, waked and brought hither by this son of Adam. The beasts, even Strawberry, all turned their eyes on Diggory till he felt that he wished the ground would swallow him up. But do not be cast down, said Aslan, still speaking to the beasts. Evil will come out of that evil, but it is still a long way off, and I will see to it that the worst falls upon myself. In the meantime, let us take such an order that for many 100 years yet this shall be a merry land in a merry world, and as Adam's race has done the harm, Adam's race shall help to heal it. Draw near, you other two. The last words were spoken to Polly and the cabby, who had now arrived. Polly, all eyes and mouth, was staring at Aslan and holding the cabby's hand rather tightly. The cabby gave one glance at the lion and took off his boiler hat. No one had yet seen him without it. When it was off, he looked younger and nicer, and more like a countryman and less like a London cabman. Son, said Aslan to the cabby, I have known you long. Do you know me? Well, no, sir, said the cabby, leastways not in an ordinary manner of speaking. Yet I feel somehow, if I may make so free, as how we've met before. It is well, said the lion. You know better than you think you know, and you shall live to know me better yet. How does this land please you? It's a fair treat, sir, said the cabby. Would you like to live here always? Well, you see, sir, I'm a married man, said the cabby. If my wife was here, neither of us would ever want to go back to London, I really reckon. We're both country folks, really. Aslan threw up his shaggy head, opened his mouth, and uttered a long single note, not very loud, but full of power. Polly's heart jumped in her body when she heard it. She felt sure that it was a call, and that anyone who heard the call would want to obey it, and what's more, would be able to obey it. However, many worlds and ages lay between, and so, though she was filled with wonder, she was not really astonished or shocked when all of a sudden a young woman with a kind, honest face stepped out of nowhere and stood beside her. Polly knew at once that it was the cabby's wife, fetched out of our world not by any tiresome magic rings, but quickly, simply and sweetly as a bird flies to its nest. The young woman had apparently been in the middle of a washing day, for she wore an apron. Her sleeves were rolled up to the elbow, and there were soap suds on her hands. If she had time to put on her good clothes, her best hat had imitation cherries on it. She would have looked dreadful. As it was, she looked rather nice. Of course she thought she was dreaming. That was why she didn't rush across to her husband and ask him what on earth had happened to them both. But when she looked at the lion, she didn't feel quite so sure it was a dream. Yet for some reason she did not appear to be very frightened. When she dropped a little half-curtsy, as some country girls still knew how to do in those days, after that she went and put her hand in the cabby's and stood there looking round her a little shyly. My children, said Aslan, fixing his eyes on both of them, you are to be the first king and queen of Narnia. The cabby opened his mouth in astonishment, and his wife turned very red. You shall rule and name all these creatures, and do justice among them, and protect them from their enemies when enemies arise. And enemies will arise, for there is an evil witch in this world. The cabby swallowed hard 2 or 3 times and cleared his throat. Begging your pardon, sir, he said, and thanking you very much, I'm sure, which my missus does the same, but I ain't no sort of chap for a job like that. I never had much education, you see. Well, said Aslan, you can use a spade and a plough and raise food out of the earth. Yes, sir, I could do a bit of that sort of work, being brought up to like it. Can you rule these creatures kindly and fairly, remembering that they are not slaves like the dumb beasts of the world you were born in, but talking beasts and free subjects? I see that, sir, replied the cabby. I tried to do the square thing by them all. And would you bring up your children and grandchildren to do the same? I'll be up to me to try, sir. I'll do my best, wouldn't we, Nellie? And you wouldn't have favorites either among your own children or among the other creatures, or let any hold another under, or use it hardly? I could never abide on such goings-on, sir, and that's the truth. I'd give 'em what if I caught them at it, said the cabby. And although this conversation his voice was growing slower and richer, more like the country voice he must have had as a boy, and less like the sharp, quick voice of a cockney. And if enemies came against the land, for enemies will arise, and there was war, would you be the first in the charge and the last in the retreat? Well, sir, said the cabby very slowly, a chap don't exactly know until he's been tried. I dare say I might turn out ever such a soft un. Never did no fighting except with my fists. I'd try, that is, I'd hope I'd try to do my best. Then, said Aslan, you will have done all that a king should do. Your coronation will be held presently, and your children and grandchildren shall be blessed, and some will be kings of Narnia, and other will be kings of Archenland, which lies yonder over the southern mountains. And you, little daughter, here he turned to Polly, are welcome. Have you forgiven the boy for the violence he did at the Hall of Images in the desolate palace of the accursed Charing? Yes, Aslan, we've made it up, said Polly. That is well, said Aslan, and for now, the boy himself. Chapter 12. Strawberry's Adventure. Diggory kept his mouth very tight shut. He had been growing more and more uncomfortable. He hoped that whatever happened he wouldn't blurb or do anything ridiculous. Son of Adam, said Aslan, are you ready to undo the wrong that you have done to my sweet country of Narnia on the very day of its birth? Well, I don't see what I can do, said Diggory. You see, the queen ran away, and I asked, are you ready? Said the lion. Yes, said Diggory. He had for a second some wild idea of saying, I'll try to help you if you promise to help my mother. But he realized in time that the lion was not at all the sort of a person one would try to make bargains with. But when he had said yes, he thought of his mother, and he thought of the great hopes he had, and how they were all dying away, and a lump came to his throat and tears in his eyes, and he blurted out, But please, won't you? Can't you give me something that will cure Mother? Up until then he had been looking at the lion's great feet and the huge claws on them. Now in his despair he looked up at his face. What he saw surprised him as much as anything in his whole life, for the tawny face was bent down near his own, and, wonder of wonders, great shining tears stood in the lion's eyes. They were such big bright tears compared with Diggory's own that for a moment he felt as if the lion must really be sorrier about his mother than he was himself. My son, said Aslan, I know grief is great. Only you and I in this land know that yet. Let it be good to one another. But I will have to think of hundreds of years in the life of Narnia. The witch whom you have brought back into this world will come back to Narnia again, but it need not be yet. It is my wish to plant in Narnia a tree that she will not dare to approach, and that tree will protect Narnia from her for many a year. So this land shall have a long, bright morning before any clouds come over the sun. You must get me the seed from which that tree is to grow. Yes, sir, said Diggory. He didn't quite know how it was to be done, but he felt quite sure now that he would be able to do it. The lion drew a deep breath, stooped his head even lower, and gave him a lion's kiss. And at once Diggory felt that new strength and courage had gone into him. Dear son, said Aslan, I will tell you what you must do. Turn and look to the west, and tell me what you see. I see terribly big mountains, Aslan, said Diggory. I've seen this river coming down cliffs in a waterfall, and beyond the cliff there are high green hills and forests, and beyond those there are higher ranges that look almost black, and then far away there are big snowy mountains all heaped up together, like pictures of the Alps, and behind those there's nothing but the sky. You see well, said the lion. Now the land of Narnia ends where the waterfall comes down, and once you have reached the top of the cliffs you will be out of Narnia and into the western wild. You must journey through those mountains till you find a green valley with a blue lake in it, walled all around by mountains of ice. At the end of the lake there is a steep green hill. On the top of that hill there is a garden. In the center of that garden is a tree. Pluck an apple from that tree and bring it back to me. Yes, sir, said Diggory again. He hadn't the least idea of how he was to climb the cliff and find his way all along the mountains, but he didn't like to say that for fear it would sound like making excuses. But he did say, I hope, Aslan, you're not in any hurry. I shan't be able to get there and back very quickly. Little son of Adam, you shall have help, said Aslan. Then he turned to the horse, who had been standing quietly beside them all this whole time, swishing his tail to keep the flies off, and listening with his head on one side as if the conversation were a little difficult to understand. "My dear," said Aslan to the horse, "would you like to be a winged horse?" Should have seen how the horse shook his mane, and how his nostrils widened, and the little tap it gave on the ground with one black hoof. Clearly it would like very much to be a winged horse, but it only said, "If you wish, Aslan, if you really mean. I don't know why it should be me. I'm not a very clever horse." "Be winged. Be the father of all flying horses," roared Aslan in a voice that shook the ground. "Your name is Fledge." The horse shielded, just as it might have shied in the old miserable days when it put on a hansom. Then it roared, it strained its neck back as if there were a fly biting its shoulder, and it wanted to scratch them. And then, just as the beast had burst out of the earth, there burst out from the shoulders of Fledge wings that spread and grew larger than the eagle's, larger than the swan's, larger than the angel's wings in church windows. The feathers shone chestnut color and copper color. He gave a great sweep with them and leaped into the air. 20 feet above Aslan and Diggory he snorted, neighed, and curveted. Then, after circling once around them, he dropped to the earth, all 4 hoofs together, looking awkward and surprised, but extremely pleased. "Is it good, Fledge?" asked Aslan. "It is very good, Aslan," said Fledge. "Would you carry this little son of Adam on your back to the mountain valley I spoke of?" "What, now? At once?" said Strawberry, or Fledge, as we must call him now. "Hurrah! Come on, little one. I've had things like you on my back before, long, long ago, when there were green fields and sugar." "What are the 2 daughters of Eve whispering about?" said Aslan, turning very suddenly on Polly and the cabbie's wife, who had, in fact, been making friends. "If you please, sir," said Queen Helen, for that is what Nellie, the cabman's wife, was now, "I think the little girl would love to go too, if it weren't no trouble." "What does Fledge say about that?" asked the lion. "Oh, I don't mind too, not when they're little ones," said Fledge, "but I hope the elephant doesn't want to come as well." The elephant had no such wish, and the new king in Narnia helped both the children up. That is, he gave Diggory a rough heave and set Polly as gently and daintily on the horse's back as if she were made of china and might break. "There they are, Strawberry, Fledge, I should say. This is a rum go." "Do not fly too high," said Aslan. "Do not try to go over the tops of the great ice mountains. Look out for the valleys, the green places, and fly through them. There will always be a way through. And now be gone with my blessing." "Oh, Fledge," said Diggory, leaning forward to pat the horse's glossy neck, "this is fun. Hold on to me tight, Polly." Next moment the country dropped away beneath them and whirled around as Fledge, like a huge pigeon, circled once or twice before setting off on his long westward flight. Looking down, Polly could hardly see the king and queen, and even Aslan himself was only a bright yellow spot on the green grass. Soon the wind was in their faces, and Fledge's wings settled down to a steady beat. All Narnia, many-colored with lawns and rocks and heather and different sorts of trees, lay spread out below them, the river winding through it like a ribbon of quicksilver. They could already see over the tops of the low hills which lay northwards on their right. Beyond those hills a great moorland sloped gently up and up to the horizon. On their left the mountains were much higher, but every now and then there was a gap where you could see, between the steep pine woods, a glimpse of the southern lands that lay beyond them, looking blue and far away. "That'll be where Archenland is," said Polly. "Yes, but look ahead," said Diggory. For now a great barrier of cliffs rose before them, and they were almost dazzled by the sunlight dancing on the great waterfall by which the river roars and sparkles down into Narnia itself from the high western lands in which it rises. They were flying so high already that the thunder of those falls could only just be heard as a small thin sound, but they were not yet high enough to fly over the tops of the cliffs. "We'll have to do a bit of zigzagging here," said Fledge. "Hold on tight." He began flying to and fro, getting higher at each turn. The air grew colder, and they heard the call of eagles far below them. "I say, look back, look behind," said Polly. There they could see the whole valley of Narnia stretched out to where, just before the eastern horizon, there was a gleam of the sea, and now they were so high they could see tiny-looking jagged mountains appearing beyond the northwest moors and the plains of what looked like sand far in the south. "I wish we had someone to tell us what all these places are," said Diggory. "I don't suppose they're anywhere yet," said Polly. "I mean, there's no one there, and nothing happening. The world only began today." "No, but people will get there," said Diggory, "and then they'll have histories, you know." "Well, it's a jolly good thing they haven't now," said Polly, "because nobody can be made to learn it. Battles and dates and all that rot." Now they were over the top of the cliffs, and in a few minutes the valley of Narnia had sunk out of sight beneath them. They were flying over a wild country of steep hills and dark forests, still following the course of the river. The really big mountains loomed ahead, but the sun was now in the travelers' eyes, and they couldn't see things very clearly in that direction, for the sun sank low and lower until the western sky was all like one great furnace full of melted gold, and it set at last behind a jagged peak which stood up against the brightness as sharp and as flat as if it were cut out of cardboard. "It's none too warm up here," said Polly. "And my wings are beginning to ache," said Fledge. "There's no sign of the valley with a lake in it, like what Aslan said. What about coming down and looking for a decent spot to spend the night in? We shan't reach that place tonight." "Yes, and surely it's about time for supper," said Diggory. So Fledge came lower and lower. As they came down near to the earth and among the hills, the air grew warmer, and after traveling so many hours with nothing to listen to but the beat of Fledge's wings, it was nice to hear the homely and earthly noises again. The chatter of the river on its stony bed, and the creaking of trees in the light wind. A warm, good smell of sun-baked earth and grass and flowers came up to them. At last Fledge alighted. Diggory rolled off and helped Polly to dismount. Both were glad to stretch their stiff legs. The valley in which they had come down was in the heart of the mountain's snowy heights, one of them looking rose-red in the reflections of the sunset towering above them. "I am hungry," said Diggory. "Well, tuck in," said Fledge, taking a big mouthful of grass. Then he raised his head, still chewing on it, with bits of grass sticking out on each side of his mouth like whiskers, and said, "Come on, you two, don't be shy. There's plenty for all of us." "But we can't eat grass," said Diggory. Said Fledge, speaking with his mouth full. "Well, don't know quite what you'll do then. Very good grass, too." Polly and Diggory stared at one another in dismay. "Well, I do think someone might have arranged about our meals," said Diggory. "I'm sure Aslan would have if you had asked him," said Fledge. "Wouldn't he know without being asked?" said Polly. "I've no doubt he would," said the horse, still with a mouthful. "But I've got a sort of idea he likes to be asked." "But what on earth are we to do?" asked Diggory. "I'm sure I don't know," said Fledge. "Unless you try the grass, you might like it better than you think." "Oh, don't be silly," said Polly, stamping her foot. "Of course humans can't eat grass any more than you could eat a mutton chop." "For goodness sake, don't talk about chops and things," said Diggory. "It only makes it worse." Diggory said that Polly had better take herself home by the ring and get something to eat there. He couldn't himself, because he had promised to go straight on his message for Aslan, and for once he showed up again at home, anything might happen to prevent his getting back. But Polly said she wouldn't leave him, and Diggory said it was jolly decent of her. "I say," said Polly, "I still got the remains of that bag of toffee in my jacket. It'll be better than nothing." "A lot better," said Diggory, "but be careful to get your hands in your pocket without touching your ring." This was a difficult and delicate job, but as they managed it in the end. The little paper bag was very squishy and sticky when they finally got it out, so that it was more of a question of tearing the bag off the toffee rather than getting the toffee out of the bag. Some grown-ups, you know how fussy they can be about that sort of thing, would rather have gone without supper altogether than eaten those toffees. There were 9 of them, all told. It was Diggory who had the bright idea of eating 4 each and planting the 9th. For, as he said, if the bars off the lamp-post turned into a little light tree, why shouldn't this turn into a toffee tree? So they dibbled a small hole in the turf and buried the piece of toffee. Then they ate the other pieces, making them last as long as they could. It was a poor meal, even with all the paper. They couldn't help eating as well. When Fledge had quite finished his own excellent supper, he lay down. The children came and sat on each side of him, leaning against his warm body, and when he had spread a wing over each, they were really quite snug. As the bright young stars of that new world came out, they talked over everything. How Diggory had hoped to get something for his mother, and how instead of that he had been sent on this message. And they repeated to one another all the signs of which they would know the places they were looking for. The blue lake, and the hill with the garden on top of it. The talk was just beginning to slow down as they got sleepy, when suddenly Polly sat up awake and said, "Hush!" Everyone listened as hard as they could. "Perhaps it was only the wind in the trees," said Diggory pleasantly. "I'm not so sure," said Fledge. "Anyway, wait. There it goes again. By Aslan, it's something." The horse scrambled to his feet with a great noise and great upheaval. The children were already on theirs. Fledge trotted to and fro, sniffing and whinnying. The children tiptoed this way and that, looking behind every bush and tree. They kept on thinking they saw things, and there was one time when Polly was perfectly certain she had seen a tall dark figure gliding quickly away in a westerly direction. But they caught nothing, and in the end Fledge lay down again, and the children re-snuggled, if that's the right word, under his wings. They went to sleep at once. Fledge stayed awake much longer, moving his ears to and fro in the darkness, and sometimes giving a little shiver with his skin, as if a fly had lighted on him. But in the end, too, he slept. Chapter 13. An Unexpected Meeting. "Wake up, Diggory! Wake up, Fledge!" came the voice of Polly. "It has turned into a toffee tree, and it's the loveliest morning." The low, early sunshine was streaming through the wood, and the grass was gray with dew, and cobwebs were like silver. Just beside them was a little, very dark wooded tree, about the size of an apple tree. The leaves were whitish and rather papery, like the herb called honesty, and it was loaded with little brown fruits that looked rather like dates. "Hurrah!" said Diggory, "but I'm going to have a dip first." He rushed through a flowering thicket or two down to the river's edge. Have you ever bathed in a mountain river that is running in shallow cataracts over red and blue and yellow stones with the sun on it? It is good as the sea, in some ways almost better. Of course, he had to dress again without drying, but it was well worth it. When he came back, Polly went down and had her bathe. At least she said that's what she'd been doing, but we know she was not much of a swimmer, and perhaps it's best not to ask too many questions. Fledge visited the river too, but he only stood in midstream, stooping down for a long drink of water, and then shaking his mane and neighing several times. Polly and Diggory got to work on the toffee tree. The fruit was delicious, not exactly like toffee, softer for one thing, and juicy, but like fruit which reminded one of toffee. Fledge also made an excellent breakfast. He tried one of the toffee fruits, and he liked it, but he felt more like grass at that hour in the morning. Then with some difficulty the children got on his back, and the second journey began. It was even better than yesterday, partly because everyone was feeling so fresh, and partly because the newly risen sun was at their backs, and of course everything looks nicer when the light is behind you. It was a wonderful ride. The big snowy mountains rose above them in every direction. The valleys far beneath them were so green, and all the trees which tumbled down from the glaciers into the main river were so blue that it was like flying over gigantic pieces of jewelry. They would have liked this part of the adventure to go on longer than it did, but quite soon they were all sniffing the air and saying, "What is it? Did you smell something? And where's it coming from?" For a heavenly smell, warm and golden, as if from all the most delicate fruits and flowers of the world, was coming up from them from somewhere ahead. "It's coming from that valley with the lake on it," said Fledge. "So it is," said Diggory, "and look, there's a green hill at the far end of the lake, and look how blue the water is." "It must be the place," said all three. Fledge came lower and lower in wide circles. The icy peaks rose up higher and higher above. The air came up warmer and sweeter every moment, so sweet that it almost brought tears to your eyes. Fledge was now gliding on his great wings, spreading out motionless on each side, and his hoof pausing for the ground. The steep green tree was rushing towards them. A moment later he alighted on its slope, a little awkwardly. The children rolled off, fell without hurting themselves on the warm, fine grass, and stood up panting a little. They were about 3/4 of the way up the hill, and set out at once to climb to the top. I don't think Fledge could have managed this without his wings to balance him, and then to give him help of a flutter every now and then. All around the very top of the hill ran a high wall of green turf. Inside the wall trees were growing. Their branches hung out over the wall. Their leaves showed not only green but also blue and silver when the wind stirred them. When the travelers reached the top, they walked nearly all the way around it, outside the green wall, before they found the gates. High gates of gold, fast shut, facing due east. Up until now, I think Fledge and Polly had the idea that they would go in with Diggory, but they thought so no longer. You never saw a place which was so obviously private. You could see at a glance that it belonged to someone else. Only a fool would dream of going in unless he had been sent there on very special business. Diggory himself understood at once that the others wouldn't and couldn't come in with him. He went forward to the gates alone. When he had come up close to them, he saw words written on the gold with silver letters, something like this: "Come in by the gold gates, or not at all. Take of my fruit, for others or forbear. For those who steal, or those who climb my walls, shall find their heart's desire, and find despair." "Take of my fruit for others," said Diggory to himself. "Well, that's what I'm going to do. It means I mustn't eat any myself, I suppose. I don't know what all that jaw in the last line is about. Come in by the gold gates? Well, who'd want to climb a wall if he could get in by a gate? But how did the gates open?" He laid his hand on them, and instantly they swung apart, opening inward, turning on their hinges without the least noise. Now that he could see the place, it looked more private than ever. He went in very solemnly, looking about him. Everything was very quiet inside. Even the fountain which rose near the middle of the garden made only the faintest sound. The lovely smell was all around him. It was a happy place, but very serious. He knew which was the right tree at once, partially because it stood in the very center, and partially because the great silver apples with which it was loaded shone so, and cast a light of their own down on the shadowy places where the sunlight did not reach. He walked straight across to it, picked an apple, and put the breastpot of his Norfolk jacket, but he couldn't help looking at it and smelling it before he put it away. It would have been better if he had not. A terrible thirst and hunger came over him, and a longing to taste that fruit. He put it hastily into his pocket, but there were plenty of others. Could it be wrong to taste one? After all, he thought, the notice on the gate might not have been exactly in order. It might have been only a piece of advice, and who cares about advice? Or even if it were in order, would he disobey it by eating an apple? He had already obeyed the part about taking one for others. While he was thinking of all this, he happened to look up through the branches toward the top of the tree. There on a branch above his head a wonderful bird was roosting, roosting because it seemed almost asleep, perhaps not quite. The tiniest slit of one eye was open. It was larger than an eagle, its breast saffron, its head crested with scarlet, and its tail purple. "And it just shows," said Diggory afterwards when he was telling the story to the others, "that you can't be too careful in these magical places. You never know what may be watching you." But I think Diggory would not have taken an apple for himself in any case. Things like "do not steal" were, I think, hammered into boys' heads a good deal harder in those days than they are now. Still, we can never be certain. Diggory was turning to go to the gates when he stopped to have one last look around. He got a terrible shock. He was not alone. There, only a few yards away from him, stood the witch. She was just throwing away the core of an apple which she had eaten. The juice was darker than you would expect, and had made a horrid stain around her mouth. Diggory guessed at once that she must have climbed over the wall, and he began to see that there might be some sense in that last line about getting your heart's desire and getting despair along with it. For the witch looked stronger and prouder than ever. and even, in a way, triumphant, but her face was deadly white, white as salt. All this flashed through Diggory's mind in a second, and then he took to his heels and ran for the gates as hard as he could pelt, the witch after him. As soon as he was out, the gates closed behind him of their own accord. That gave him the lead, but not for long. By the time he had reached the others and was shouting out, "Quick, get on, Polly, get up, Fletch, the witch has climbed the wall and vaulted over it," and was close behind him again. "Stay where you are," cried Diggory, turning round to face her, "or we'll all vanish. Don't come an inch nearer." "Foolish boy," said the witch, "why do you run from me? I mean you no harm. If you do not stop and listen to me now, you will miss some knowledge that would have made you happy all your life." "Well, I don't want to hear it, thanks," said Diggory, but he did. "I know what errand you have come on," continued the witch, "for it was I who was close beside you in the woods last night and heard all your counsels. You have plucked fruit in the garden yonder, and you have carried it in your pocket now, and you are going to carry it back untasted to the lion for him to eat, for him to use. You simpleton, do you know what the fruit is? I will tell you. It is the apple of youth, the apple of life. I know, for I have tasted it, and I feel already such changes in myself that I know I shall never grow old or die. Eat it, boy, eat it, and you and I will both live forever and be king and queen of this whole world, or of your world, if we decide to go back there." "No, thanks," said Diggory. "I don't even know I care much about living on and on after everyone I know is dead. I'd rather live in ordinary time and die and go to heaven." "But what about this mother of yours whom you pretend to love so? What's she got to do with it?" said Diggory. "Do you not see, fool, that one bite of that apple would heal her? You have it in your pocket. Here we are by ourselves, and the lion is far away. Use your magic and go back to your own world. A minute later you can be at your mother's bedside giving her the fruit. 5 minutes later you could see the color coming back into her face. She will tell you the pain is gone. Soon she will tell you she feels stronger. Then she will fall asleep. Think of that. Hours of sweet natural sleep, without pain, without drugs. Next day everyone will be saying how wonderfully she has recovered. Soon she will be quite well again. All will be well again. Your home will be happy again. You will be like other boys." "Oh," gasped Diggory, as if he'd been hurt, and put his hand to his head, for he knew that the most terrible choice lay before him. What's that lion ever done for you that you should be his slave?" said the witch. "What can he do to you once you are back in your own world? And what would your mother think if she knew that you could have taken her pain away, and given her back life, and saved your father's heart from being broken, and that you wouldn't, that you'd rather run messages for a wild animal in a strange world that is no business of yours?" "I don't think he's a wild animal," said Diggory in a dried-up sort of voice. "He is... I don't know." "Then he's something worse," said the witch. "Look at what he's done to you already. Look how heartless he has made you. That is what he does to everyone who listens to him. Cruel, pitiless boy, you would let your own mother die rather than—" "Oh, shut up," said the miserable Diggory, still in the same voice. "Do you think I don't see? But I promised." "Ah, but you don't know what you were promising, and no one here can prevent you. Mother herself," said Diggory, getting the words out with difficulty, "wouldn't like it. Awfully strict about keeping promises, and not stealing, and all that sort of thing. She'd tell me not to do it, quick as anything, if she was here." "But she need never know," said the witch, speaking more sweetly than you would ever have thought anyone with such a fierce face could speak. "You wouldn't tell her how you got the apple. Your father need never know. No one in your world need know anything about this whole story. You needn't take the little girl back with you, you know." That was where the witch made her fatal mistake. Of course Diggory knew that Polly would get away by her own ring as easily as he could get away with his, but apparently the witch didn't know this, and the meanness of the suggestion that he should leave Polly behind suddenly made all the other things the witch had said sound false and hollow. And even in the midst of all his misery, his head suddenly cleared, and he said, in a different and much louder voice, "Look here, where do you come into all this? Why are you so preciously fond of my mother all of a sudden? What has it got to do with you? What's your game?" "Good for you, Diggs," whispered Polly in his ear. "Quick, Get away now. She hadn't dared to say anything all through the argument, because, you see, it wasn't her mother who was dying. Up then, said Diggory, heaving her onto Fledge's back and then scrambling up as quickly as he could. The horse spread its wings. Go then, fools, called the witch. Think of me, boy, when you lie old and weak and dying, and remember how you threw away the chance of endless youth. It won't be offered to you again. They were already so high that they could only just hear her, nor did the witch waste any time gazing up at them. They saw her set off northward down the slope of the hill. They had started early that morning, and what happened in the garden had not taken very long, so that Fledge and Polly both said they would easily get back to Narnia before nightfall. Diggory never spoke on the way back, and the others were shy of speaking to him. He was very sad, and he wasn't even sure again this time that he had done the right thing, but whenever he remembered the shining tears in Aslan's eyes, he became sure. All day Fledge flew steadily with untiring wings, eastward with river to guide them, through the mountains and over the wild wooded hills, and then over to the great waterfalls, and down, to where the woods of Narnia were darkened by the shadow of the mighty cliff, till at last, when the sky was growing red with sunlight behind them, he saw a place where many creatures were gathered together by the riverside, and soon he could see Aslan himself in the midst of them. Fledge glided down, spreading his 4 legs, closed his wings, and landed cantering. Then he pulled up. The children dismounted. Diggory saw all the animals, dwarfs, satyrs, nymphs, and other things drawing back to the left and right to make way for him. He walked up to Aslan, handed him the apple, and said, "I've brought you the apple you wanted, sir." Chapter 14. The Planting of the Tree. "Well done," said Aslan, in a voice that made the earth shake. Then Diggory knew all that the Narnians had heard those words, and from the story of them could be handed down from father to son in that new world for hundreds of years, and perhaps forever. But he was in no danger of feeling conceited, for he didn't think about it at all now that he was face to face with Aslan. This time he found he could look straight into the lion's eyes. He had forgotten his troubles and felt absolutely content. "Well done, son of Adam," said the lion. "Again, for this fruit you have hungered and thirsted and wept. No hand but yours shall sow the seed of the tree that is to be in the protection of Narnia. Throw the apple towards the river bank where the ground is soft." Diggory did as he was told. Everyone had grown so quiet that you could hear the soft thump where it fell in the mud. "It is well thrown," said Aslan. "Let us now proceed to the coronation of King Frank of Narnia and Helen, his queen." The children now noticed these two for the first time. They were dressed in strange and beautiful clothes, and from their shoulders rich robes flowed out behind them to where 4 dwarfs held up the king's train, and 4 river nymphs, the queen's. Their heads were bare, but Helen had let her hair down, and it made a great improvement in her appearance. But it was neither hair nor clothes that made them look so different from their old selves. Their faces had a new expression, especially the king's. All the sharpness and cunning and quarrelsomeness which he had picked up in London as a cabby seemed to have been washed away, and the courage and kindness which he had always had were easier to see. Perhaps it was the air of the young world that had done it, or talking with Aslan, or both. "Upon my word," whispered Fledge to Polly, "my old master's been changed nearly as much as I have. Why, he's a real master now." "Yes, but don't buzz in my ear like that," said Polly. "It tickles so." "Now," said Aslan, "some of you undo that tangle you have made with those trees, and let us see what we shall find there." Diggory now sat where 4 trees grew close together. Their branches had all been laced together or tied together with switches so as to make a sort of cage. The 2 elephants with their trunks and a few dwarfs with their little axes soon got it all undone. There were 3 things inside. One was the young tree that seemed to be made of gold. The second was the young tree that seemed to be made of silver. But the third was a miserable object in muddy clothes sitting hunched up between them. "Gosh," whispered Diggory, "Uncle Andrew." To explain all this we must go back a bit. The beast, you remember, had tried planting and watering him. When the watering brought him to his senses, he found himself soaking wet, buried up to his thighs in earth, which was quickly turning into mud, and surrounded by more wild animals than he had ever dreamed of in his life before. It was perhaps not surprising that he began to scream and howl. This was, in a way, a good thing, for it at least persuaded everyone, even the warthog, that he was alive. So they dug him up again. His trousers were in a really shocking state by now. As soon as his legs were free, he tried to bolt, but one swift curl of the elephant's trunk round his waist soon put an end to that. Everyone now thought he must be safely kept somewhere until Aslan had time to come and see him and say what should be done about him. So they made a sort of cage or coop all around him. They then offered him everything they could think of to eat. The donkey collected great piles of thistles and threw them in, but Uncle Andrew didn't seem to care about them. The squirrels bombarded him with volleys of nuts, but he only covered his head with his hands and tried to keep out of the way. Several birds flew to and fro, diligently dropping worms on him. The bear was especially kind. During the afternoon he found a wild bee's nest instead of eating it himself, which he would very much have liked to have done. This worthy creature brought it back to Uncle Andrew, but this, in fact, the worst failure of all. The bear lobbed the whole sticky mass over the top of the enclosure, and unfortunately it hit Uncle Andrew slap in the face. Not all the bees were dead. The bear, who would have not of all minded being hit in the face by a honeycomb himself, could not understand why. Uncle Andrew staggered back, slipped, and sat down. It was sheer bad luck that he sat down on the pile of thistles, and anyway, as the warthog said, quite a lot of honey has got into the creature's mouth, and that's bound to have done it some good. They were really getting quite fond of their strange pet and hoped that Aslan would allow them to keep it. The clever ones were quite sure by now that at least some of the noises which came out of this mouth had meaning. They christened him Brandy because he made that noise so often. In the end, however, they had to leave him there for the night. Aslan was busy all that day long instructing the new king and queen and doing other important things, and could not attend to poor old Brandy. What with the nuts and pears and apples and bananas that had been thrown into him, he did fairly well for supper, but it wouldn't be true to say that he passed an agreeable night. "Bring out that creature," said Aslan. One of the elephants lifted Uncle Andrew in its trunk and laid him at the lion's feet. He was too frightened to move. "Please, Aslan," said Polly, "could you say something to unfrighten him? And then could you say something to prevent him from ever coming back here again?" "Do you think he wants to?" said Aslan. "Well, Aslan," said Polly, "he might send someone else. He's so excited about the bar off the lamp-post growing into a lamp-post tree, and he thinks great folly, child," said Aslan. "This world is bursting with life for these few days because the song in which I called it into life still hangs in the air and rumbles in the ground. It will not be so for long. But I cannot tell that to this old sinner, and I cannot comfort him either. He has made himself unable to hear my voice. If I spoke to him, he would hear only growlings and roarings. Oh, Adam's sons, how cleverly you defend yourselves against all that might do you good, but I still give him the only gift he is able to receive." He bowed his great head rather sadly and breathed into the magician's terrified face. "Sleep," he said. "Sleep and be separated for some few hours from all the torments you have devised for yourself." Uncle Andrew immediately rolled over with closed eyes and began breathing peacefully. "Carry him aside and lay him down," said Aslan. "Now, dwarfs, show your smithcraft. Let me see you make 2 crowns for your king and queen." More dwarf than you could dream of rushed forward to the golden tree. They all had its trees stripped off and some of its branches torn off too, before you could say Jack Robinson. And now the children could see that it did not merely look golden, but was of real, soft gold. It had, of course, sprung up from the half-sovereigns which had fallen out of Uncle Andrew's pocket when he was turned upside down, just as the silver had grown up around the half-crowns. From nowhere, as it seems, piles of dry brushwood for fuel, a little anvil, hammers, tongs, and bellows were produced. Next moment, how these dwarfs loved their work! The fire was blazing. The bellows were roaring and the gold was melting. The hammers were clinking. 2 moles, whom Aslan had set to dig, which was what they liked to do best, earlier in the day, poured out a pile of precious stones at the dwarf's feet. Under the clever fingers of the little smiths 2 crowns took shape, not ugly, heavy things like modern European crowns, but light, delicate, beautifully shaped circles that you could really wear and look nicer by wearing. The king's was set with rubies and the queen's with emeralds. Then the crowns had been cooled on the river. Aslan made Frank and Helen kneel before him, and he placed the crowns on their head. Then he said, "Rise up, king and queen of Narnia, father and mother of many kings that shall be in Narnia and the isles of Archenland. Be just and merciful and brave. The blessing is upon you." Then everyone cheered or bayed or neighed or trumpeted or clapped its wings, and the royal pair just stood looking solemnly and a little shy, but all the nobler for their shyness. And while Diggory was still cheering, he kept hearing a voice deep of Aslan behind him saying, "Look." Everyone in that crowd turned its head, and then everyone drew a long breath of wonder and delight. A little way off, towering over their heads, they saw a tree which had certainly not been there before. It must have grown up silently, yet swiftly as a flag rises when you pull it up the flagstaff, when they were all busiest about the coronation. Its spreading branches seemed to cast a light rather than a shade, and silver apples peeped out, like stars from under every leaf. But it was the smell which came from it, even more than the sight, that had made everyone draw in their breath. For a moment one could hardly think about anything else. "Son of Adam," said Aslan, "you have sown well, and you, Narnians, let it be your first care to guard this tree, for it is your shield. The witch of whom I told you has fled far away into the north of the world, and she will live there, growing stronger in dark magic. But while that tree flourishes, she will never come down into Narnia. She dare not come within 100 miles of the tree, for its smell, which is joy and life and health to you, is death and horror and despair for her." Everyone was staring solemnly at the tree when Aslan suddenly swung around his head, scattering golden gleams of light from his mane as he did so, and fixed his eyes on the children. "What is it, children?" he said, for he caught them in the very act of whispering and nudging one another. "Oh, Aslan, sir," said Diggory, turning red, "I forgot to tell you. The witch has already eaten one of those apples, one of the same kind that tree grew from." He hadn't really said all he was thinking, but Polly at once said it for him. Diggory was always much more afraid than she of looking a fool. "So we thought, Aslan," she said, "that there must be some mistake, and she really can't mind the smell of those apples." "Why do you think that, daughter of Eve?" asked the lion. "Well, she ate one." "Child," he replied, "that's why all the rest are now a horror to her. That is what happens to those who pluck and eat fruit at the wrong time and in the wrong way. The fruit is good, but they loathe it forever after." "Oh, I see," said Polly. "And I suppose because she took it in the wrong way it won't work for her. I mean, it won't make her always young and all that." "Alas," said Aslan, shaking his head, "it will. Things always work according to their nature. She has won her heart's desire, and she has unwearying strength and endless days like a goddess. But the length of days with an evil heart is only length of misery, and already she has begun to know it. All get what they want, and they do not always like it." "I nearly ate one myself, Aslan," said Diggory. "Would I?" "You would, child," said Aslan, "for the fruit always works. It must work. But it does not work happily for anyone who plucks it at their own will. If any Narnian, unbidden, had stolen an apple and planted it here to protect Narnia, it would have protected Narnia. But it would have done so by making Narnia into another strong and cruel empire like Charon, not the kindly land I mean it to be. And the witch tempted you to do another thing, my son, did she not?" "Yes, Aslan, she wanted me to take an apple home to my mother. Understand, then, that it would have healed her, but not to your joy or hers. The day would have come when both you and she would have looked back and said it would have been better to die than in illness." And Diggory could not say nothing, for tears choked him, and he gave up all hopes of saving his mother's life. But at the same time he knew that the lion knew that what would have happened, and there might be things more terrible even than losing someone you loved by death. But now Aslan was speaking again, almost in a whisper. That is what would have happened, child, with a stolen apple. It is not what will happen now. What I will give you will bring joy. It will not, in your world, give endless life, but it will heal. Go, pluck her an apple from the tree. For a second, Diggory could hardly understand. It was as if the whole world was turned upside down and inside out. And then, like someone in a dream, he was walking across to the tree, and the king and queen were cheering him, and all the creatures were cheering too. He plucked the apple and put it in his pocket. Then he came back to Aslan. Please, may we go home now? He had forgotten to say thank you, but he meant it, and Aslan understood. Chapter 15. The end of this story and the beginning of all the others. You need no rings when I'm with you, said the voice of Aslan. The children blinked and looked about them. They were once more in the wood between the worlds. Uncle Andrew lay on the grass, still asleep, and Aslan stood beside them. Come, said Aslan, it is time that you went back. But there are two things to see first, a warning and a command. Look here, children. They looked and saw a little hollow in the grass, with the grassy bottom warm and dry. When you were last here, said Aslan, that hollow was a pool, and when you jumped into it you came to the world where a dying sun shone over the ruins of Charn. There is no pool now, that world is ended, and if you have never been, let the race of Adam and Eve take warning. Yes, Aslan, said both the children, but Polly added, but we're not quite as bad as that world, are we, Aslan? Not yet, daughter of Eve, he said, not yet, but you are growing more like it. It is not certain that some wicked one of your race will not find out a secret as evil as the deplorable world, to use it to destroy all living things. And soon, very soon, before you are an old man and an old woman, great nations in your world will be ruled by tyrants, who care no more for joy and justice and mercy than the Empress Jadis. Let your world beware. That is the warning. Now for the command. As soon as you can, take from this uncle of yours his magic rings and bury them so that no one can use them again. Both the children were looking up into the lion's face as he spoke these words, and all at once, they never knew exactly how it happened, the face seemed to be a sea of tossing gold in which they were floating, and such a sweetness and power rolled them out over them, and they entered them that they felt so good they had never really been happy or wise or good or even alive and awake before, and the memory of that moment stayed with them always, so that as long as they both lived, if they ever were sad or afraid or angry, the thought of all that golden goodness and the feeling that it was still there, quite close, just around some corner or behind some door, would come back and make them sure, deep down inside, that all was well. Next minute, all three of them, Uncle Andrew now awake, came tumbling into the noise, heat, and hot smells of London. They were on the pavement outside the Ketterleys' front door, and except that the witch, the horse, and the cabby were gone, everything was exactly as they had left it. There was the lamp-post, with one arm missing, there was the wreck of the hansom cab, and there was the crowd. Everyone was still talking, and people were kneeling beside the damaged policeman, saying things like, "He's coming around," or "How do you feel now, old chap?" or "The ambulance will be here in a jiffy." Great Scott, thought Diggory, I believe the whole adventure taken no time at all. Most people were wildly looking round for Jardis and the horse. No one took any notice of the children, for no one had seen them go, and no one had noticed them coming back. As for Uncle Andrew, what had been in the state of his clothes and the honey on his face, he could not have been recognized by anyone. Fortunately, the front door of the house was open, and the housemaid was standing in the doorway staring at the fun. What a day that girl was having! So the children had no difficulty in bustling Uncle Andrew indoors before anyone asked any questions. He raced up the stairs before them, and at first they were very afraid he was heading for his attic, and meant to hide his remaining magic rings. But they needn't have bothered. What he was thinking about was the bottle in his wardrobe, and he disappeared at once into his bedroom and locked the door. When he came out again, which was not for a long time, He was in his dressing gown and made straight for the bathroom. "Can you get the other rings, Paul?" said Diggory. "I want to go see Mother." "Right, see you later," said Polly, and clattered up the attic stairs. Then Diggory took a minute to get his breath, and then he went softly into his mother's room, and there she lay, as he had seen her lie so many times, propped up on the pillows, with a thin, pale face that would make you cry to look at it. Diggory took the apple of life out of his pocket, and just as the witch Jadis had looked different when you saw her in our world instead of her own, so the fruit of that mountain garden looked different too. There were, of course, all sorts of things in the bedroom: the colored counterpane on the window, the wallpaper, the sunlight from the window, and Mother's pretty pale blue dressing jacket. But the moment Diggory took the apple out of his pocket, all those things seemed to have scarcely any color at all. Every one of them, even the sunlight, looked faded and dingy. The brightness of the apple threw strange lights on the ceiling. Nothing else was worth looking at, and you couldn't look at anything else, and the smell of the apple of youth was as if there was a window in the room that opened onto heaven. "Oh, darling, how lovely," said Diggory's mother. "You will eat it, won't you, please?" said Diggory. "I don't know what the doctor would say," she answered, "but really, I almost feel as if I could." He peeled it and cut it up, and gave it to her piece by piece. And no sooner had she finished it than she smiled, and her head sank back on the pillow, and she was asleep. A real, natural, gentle sleep, without any of those nasty drugs, which was, as Diggory knew, the thing in the whole world that she wanted most. And he was sure now that her face looked a little different. He bent down and kissed her softly, and stole out of the room with a beating heart, taking the core of the apple with him. For the rest of that day, whenever he looked at the things about him, and saw how ordinary and unmagical they were, he hardly dared to hope. But when he remembered the face of Aslan, he did hope. That evening he buried the core of the apple in the backyard. Next morning, when the doctor made his usual visit, Diggory leaned over the banister to listen. He heard the doctor come out with Aunt Letty and say, "Miss Ketterly, this is the most extraordinary case I have known in my whole medical career. It is like a miracle. I wouldn't tell the little boy anything at present. We don't want to raise any false hopes. But in my opinion," then his voice became too low to hear. That afternoon he went down to the garden and whistled their agreed secret signal for Polly. She hadn't been able to get back the day before. "What luck," said Polly, looking over the wall. "I mean about your mother." I think it's going to be all right," said Diggory. "But if you don't mind, I'd really rather not talk about it yet. What about the rings?" "I've got them all," said Polly. "Look, it's all right. I'm wearing gloves. Let's bury them." "Yes, let's. I've marked the place yesterday where I buried the core of the apple yesterday." Then Polly came over to the wall, and they went together to the place. But as it turned out, Diggory need not have marked the place. Something was already coming up. It was not growing so that you could see it grow, as the new trees had done in Narnia, but it was already well above ground. They got a trowel and buried all the magic rings, including their own ones, in a circle around it. About a week after this, it was quite certain that Diggory's mother was getting better. About a fortnight, she was able to sit in the garden, and a month later, the whole house had become a different place. Aunt Letty did everything that Mother liked. Windows were open, frowsy curtains were drawn back to brighten up the rooms. There were new flowers everywhere and nicer things to eat, and the old piano was tuned, and Mother took up her singing again, and had such games with Diggory and Polly that Aunt Letty would say, "I declare, Mabel, you're the biggest baby of the three." When things go wrong, you find they usually go on getting worse for some times. But when things start going right, they often go on getting better and better. And after about 6 weeks of this lovely life, there came a long letter from a father in India, which had wonderful news in it. Old great-uncle Kirk had died, and this meant apparently that father was now very rich. He was going to retire and come home from India forever and ever, and the great big house in the country which Diggory had heard of all his life and never seen would now be their home. And the big house, with the suits of armor, the stables, the kennels, the river, the parks, the hothouses, the vineries, the woods, and the mountains behind it. so that Diggory felt just as sure as you that they were going to all live happily ever after. But perhaps you would like to know just one or two more things. Polly and Diggory were always great friends, and she came nearly every holiday to stay with them at their beautiful house in the country, and that was where she learned to ride and swim and milk and bake and climb. In Narnia the beasts lived in great peace and joy, and neither the witch nor any other enemy came to trouble that pleasant land for many hundreds of years. King Frank and Queen Helen and their children lived happily in Narnia, and their second son became king of Archenland. The boys married nymphs, and the girls married wood gods and river gods. The lampposts, which the witch had planted, without knowing it, shone day and night in the Narnian forest, so that the place where it grew came to be called Lantern Waste. And when many years later another child from our world got into Narnia on a snowy night, she found the light still burning, and that adventure was, in a way, connected with the ones I've been telling you. It was like this. The tree which sprang from the apple that Diggory planted in the back garden lived and grew into a fine tree, growing in the soil of our world, far out of the sound of Aslan's voice and far from the young air of Narnia. It did not bear apples that would revive a dying woman as Diggory's mother had revived, though it did bear apples more beautiful than any others in England, and they were extremely good for you, though not fully magical. But inside itself, in the very sap of it, the tree, so to speak, never forgot that some other tree in Narnia to which it belonged. Sometimes it would move mysteriously when there was no wind blowing. I think that is what happened there when high winds in Narnia and the English tree quivered, because at that moment the Narnia tree was rocking and swaying in a strong southwestern gale. However that might be, it was proved later that there was still magic in its wood, for when Diggory was quite middle-aged, and he was a famous learned man, a professor, and a great traveler by that time, and the Ketterleys' old house belonged to him, there was a great storm over all the south of England which blew the tree down. He couldn't bear to have it simply chopped up for firewood, so he had part of the timber made into a wardrobe, which he put in his big house in the country. And though he himself did not discover the magic properties of the wardrobe, someone else did. That was the beginning of all the comings and goings between Narnia and our world, which you read in other books. When Diggory and his people went to live in the big country house, they took Uncle Andrew to live with them, for Diggory's father said, "We must try to keep the old fellow out of mischief, and it isn't fair that poor Letty should have him always on her hands." Uncle Andrew never tried any magic again as long as he lived. He had learned his lesson, and in his old age he became a nicer and less selfish old man than he had ever been before. But he always liked to get visitors alone in the billiard room and tell them stories about a mysterious lady, a foreign royalty with whom he had driven about London. A devilish temper she had, he would say, but she was a dem fine woman, sir, a dem fine woman. The end.